Well, good morning. It is good to see you today. We've had a busy weekend with this congregation. On Friday, there were 2 babies born. Alyssa and Sam Robinson had their son. Anthony and Tracy became grandparents once more down in Mississippi. And on Saturday, Dylan, who's moved across the country from us, but she was finally married. And man, it's just been a life-giving weekend for the longer fingers that our congregation hold in the country, I would say. So this morning we're going to be starting a new sermon series that will be going through for about 4 to 5 weeks. We're calling it Gathered. Gathered, and you could probably tell, there we go, what that topic is all about. All right, it's about what we're doing right now. It's about the gathering of the people of God, the assembly of the saints, this aspect of our faith where we come together as one community. It is extremely important, a part of what it means to be a Christian. And I really want us to stop and to focus on that over the next month or so. Because it can be very easy to forget the deeper level of what happens here. I mean, on a surface level, what happens right here in this assembly might not seem overly important. It might not seem overly special. In fact, to a non-believer, if he were to take an image of a Sunday morning worship service, to him or her, it might not look any different than a movie theater or any other secular place where we gather in one spot, face forward, sit quietly, take something in, and then leave. You know, if we begin to view the gathering of God's people in that arbitrary way, we're really not seeing it for what it genuinely is or what it genuinely can be. The assembly is so much more than just a room with full seats. It's an encounter with the living God. It's a moment where we recenter our lives around what really matters. It's an inbreaking of heaven on earth and so much more. So I really look forward to being able to rediscover these things, to renew our appreciation of what the gathered people of God is all about over the next 4 to 5 weeks. That what we do together when we come as one, that it genuinely and truly and deeply matters and it shapes us and more. Now, of course, on top of those positive things, this is also partially motivated by the fact that church gatherings seem less important to people now than they have over the last 100 years or even more, right? Especially in our culture, especially in the Western side of the world. And I'm not even talking about non-believers, although there are more people who claim to be atheist or non-religious these days. And so obviously there's going to be less people concerned with Christian gatherings because of that. But even just believers. I'm talking about people who claim to believe in God, who claim to believe in the Bible. There's this phenomenon that's been happening in our culture over the last couple of decades of people who want to have this personal, genuine relationship with Jesus Christ, but want nothing to do with His church. And I think I've made this reference before, but I like to call this phenomenon the Jesus is my boyfriend religion, okay? Jesus is my boyfriend. That, hey, it's me and it's Jesus and we love each other, but we don't really need you guys. We don't really need anything else. We're fine without you. You know, that becomes so prevalent in the world. I'm sure you know people who are like that, or maybe you even feel that way yourself. And I can understand why that is. Let me just pause for a second to be clear. I understand why that is a thing, why that is a temptation and a desire. You know, our sermon next week is going to be largely about how much the church has hurt people and how much the church has failed to do its job and why it has driven people away from the church. We're going to talk about that. We're going to be honest about that. So I understand why people would have this desire to have Jesus, who's great, but not have us who are maybe not so great, right? And I understand that. But, you know, I still don't think it's the healthiest path forward. I still don't think it's the healthiest faith. You know, one of the most common titles for the church in the Bible for the church is what? One of the most common titles for the church in the Bible is the bride of Christ. Yeah. Now, I can't speak for everybody, but if I'm continually around you and you have this just utter disdain for my wife, we're probably not going to be getting along so well, all right? I'm not sure people can continue to bash on the church, Christ's bride, and think that their relationship with Christ is very good at all. Okay, there's more that goes into that. Not to mention that this view of Jesus without the church is a completely new one. For the first 2,000 years of Christianity, this did not exist as an option. You did not think you could have a relationship with Jesus without the church for the last 2,000 years. It's only a new phenomenon that's been happening in our world that's hyper-focused on individualism and doing things by ourselves in our own ways. And so I want us to see that option, while so many people are taking it, is not the better way. One of the things I want to do over the next 4 weeks is to say, I understand that, but there is a better way forward. There is a better way to life. There is a better way to faith that includes a community. And of course, another factor here is inevitably COVID. The pandemic, the isolations, the quarantines, they sped up that growing trend in our world, that the assembly, that gathering, that being here on the first day of the week doesn't matter. And I like to think that, and I'll be upfront about this, I like to think I've been a strong defender for those who can't be here because of the pandemic. People who have surgeries upcoming, people who have autoimmune disorders. I have been a defender of their ability to stay home and worship virtually, okay? There's something to be said about wisdom. There's something to be said about stewardship of our bodies. There's something to be said about loving your neighbor. And so I've really tried to support that. And still, right now, I'm not trying to guilt people who are virtual for health reasons or whatever. I know of a handful in our congregation who are not here but desperately want to be, but they are choosing to be worshiped with us virtually. And in a sense, a part of this assembly because of that, because they have things going on in their lives. But what I am trying to do is preventively combat the larger temptation that has come to all of us because of COVID, right? There is a greater temptation when we weren't assembling for large parts of 2020 that's come about, that we don't have to be together. In fact, there have been studies done that are saying from the difference in 2019 to the difference in today's congregations, not just in the Church of Christ, but across Christianity in America, that a morning worship service is on average 30% less than it was before. 30%, okay? This is a temptation that our world is facing. You know, and I have had good and faithful mentors who have been instrumental in who I am as a man in Christ, who have expressed to me that, hey, after COVID, I don't really feel like getting up out of bed to go to church on Sunday mornings. I don't find it as important as I once did. And I got to admit that cuts me. To see people I admire and that I love, to have this ambivalence for what I truly think is so important. Not just because we have these arbitrary commands that we're supposed to be here, but no, this is a phenomenal, impactful, transformational thing that when we gather together on Sunday mornings. And so I want us to take the time as a church family to be reminded of this, to look at these ideas and be renewed for our love for this transformational gathering of God's children. So one little caveat before we dive in, and I know I've already spent about half of our sermon time introducing this series, which is okay. I mean, really, my whole point today was just to get across how important the gathering of God's people is. And so I feel like we're still doing that, but I know it's a big introduction here. But one last caveat. I'm not talking about you, okay? I am not talking about you. You know, if you've been out on vacation, if you've been out sick, if you're not here, if you haven't been here, whatever the reason may be, please be assured, I am not talking about you. If you're watching online, I am not talking about you. I have no body in mind when I do this. In fact, I had this idea for this series all the way back in February. I came up and said, I want to do a series on the gathering of God's people in February. And then I held off because we were doing Romans. And then I got to the summer, and I was like, man, it'd be really ironic to talk about how important it is for us to gather together in the summertime while everyone's leaving on vacations. So we're just going to wait until the fall comes, all right? So this has been a long time coming. This is not honed in or directed at anyone. It's for all of us to grow together in the love of the church and the God who is above that church. So with that being said, where do you start a series like this? If you want to talk about how important it is to gather the Christians together, to worship God, to be a community, where do you start? There's one specific passage that gets used a ton. It's Hebrews 10, 24, and 25. You'll recognize it when I put it up here. Might need to change some batteries. I think Mark broke my thing. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Ben, can you hit that for me? Thank you. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Have you heard this before? And some translations that you might recognize better even says, do not forsake the assembly. Now, before we really get into this, I also, another little introduction caveat thing here, allow me to point out that this verse has been used to hurt as many people as it has been used to help people. And maybe you're one of those people. Maybe you've been hurt by this, that people have wielded this verse as a weapon against you instead of an encouragement for you. Folks have been condemned by this verse by staying at home with the flu instead of coming and infecting other people. Folks have been condemned when they got stuck with a Wednesday night shift and had to miss a Wednesday night service because of work. And I'm not sure that the writer of Hebrews had that in mind when he wrote this passage. I did not think that when he wrote this, he thought people 2,000 years later would be using it to condemn someone who was on vacation on a Sunday and wasn't here with their church family. This is not what the passage is talking about. It's not a condemnation for the person who's sick and cannot make it on a Sunday morning, all right? What's happening here is where it talks about not giving up meeting. It's a participle. Now, trust me, as an Indiana boy, grammar is not my thing. I've had to learn a little bit more as I've gotten into these studies, but it's a participle. It's supposed to be translated as a continual act. We should read it as, do not continually give up meeting together. And his next words even emphasize it more. He says, as some are in the habit of doing. What the Bible is talking about here is a continual habit of not being with the assembled church. It's not about missing it one time. It's not to condemn someone who couldn't make a given Sunday. Delaney and I were on vacation a few months ago. We went to Chicago. As we were driving home on a Sunday, we didn't stop and find a church in Northwest Indiana, okay? We didn't find a church and break off and go and join them. What we did instead was we logged online and we watched Stan's message here. Partially because we wanted to stay up to date with what was happening with our specific and immediate church family. Partially because we were trying to get home to our kids that we missed a lot. We didn't forsake the assembly, but yet some people would have a problem with that. And I apologize if you're one of those people who has a problem with that. But we were choosing to have a faithful interaction with the church in a different way. And that's not what the writer of Hebrews is talking about here. He's talking about a continual habit of, and I think forsaking could be a good word here. It has that connotation, right, of forsaking God's gathered people away from each other. It's supposed to be an encouragement about what is really good and what really matters. Now, I got to admit, it might sound like I'm making the argument on the wrong side here, right? That I'm making the wrong argument if I'm trying to give a series on why we should gather together as a church. To point out that this verse isn't directly condemning anyone who ever misses a service might seem like I'm freeing up people to miss more church, right? It could kind of come across that way. But I think sometimes, we have to wash away the harmful legalism before we can build something better, don't you? Sometimes we have to wash away the harmful legalism that hurts people so we can build something better. There's still instruction here, clear, obvious instruction here for Christians to gather, to come together and worship God and to edify each other. It's important, and it says that. But I don't feel like I have to scare you into that, okay? I don't feel like the Bible needs to or wants to scare you into that. When you take away the fear and the condemnation, maybe you can start to see the good and the beauty that happens right here, in this room in which you sit, and what's happening right now. And there are so many positives right here. There is so much joy in life and growth that happens when Christians assemble together and focus on God. A repeated practice of coming together with those who have been washed by the blood of Christ will only give us better and full and abundant, like last week, life, right? We should get to a place in our lives, and I hope many of you might already be there. Some of you might be struggling to get to that point. But I would hope that all of us could get to a point where a prolonged absence from Christian gatherings sounds completely unpleasant to us. That instead of feeling drained by getting up on a Sunday morning and dressing up and showing up at church, that you would feel drained if you weren't here. If you would feel like your battery had been run out all week and that you didn't get that charging that happens right here together in this room. Sometimes it's in that room. Sometimes it's at a charity organization downtown, right? It's about the gathered people of God. Sometimes it's in living rooms and so much more. You know, in fact, in the Bible, when the apostles and these early disciples were separated from meeting with the church, whether because they were traveling or oftentimes in prison or whatever, they write about how badly they wish they could be together. They wish they could be with the other people. Ben, could you hit this for me? You know, 2 Timothy 1:4, Paul in prison says, recalling your tears, Timothy, I long to see you that I may be filled with joy. He's in prison and he misses him. To the Thessalonians, he writes, night and day we pray most earnestly that we might see you again. And then John, possibly even in exile at this point, he writes, I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and to talk with you face to face so that our joy might be complete. You know, I find it convicting to see how valuable they found Christian fellowship, to see how valuable they found gathered Christian worship, and how often we, and I'll be honest, how often I take it for granted, right? We take it for granted so easily. And I got to say, I think COVID, for all of its frustrations, gave us a small, blessing and a small insight into how they might have felt, especially for that larger quarantine, isolation, whatever you want to call it, in the spring of 2020. You know, we didn't have gatherings for months. Do you remember this? I remember it because me, Rich, Andy, and Mark, we'd sit right here, right? And we'd get up here by ourselves and preach to an empty room, and it wasn't a lot of fun. We didn't get to see each other. I had new babies. I wasn't doing visits. I wasn't doing rounds. I was in the uncertainty of it all. We didn't have that gathering. We didn't have that community. And for many of us, it was the longest extended period away from the church we've experienced in our life. I heard so many stories from our elderly people talking about that. People who are in their golden years of life, who this was new territory for them. And they shared with me how they missed things that they didn't even know that they would miss. The little conversations, the little interactions, the off-key singing sometimes. The things that we might take for granted or might even complain about. When we didn't have it, we found out how much we missed it. It was an interesting chance for us to rediscover the beauty of the gathering by having it taken away from us for a little while. You know, we can take Satan's attacks and we can let it work for the good, can't we? And yet here we are only a couple of short years later, and we can start to take things for granted again. You know, I think about the thousands of Christians who gather under an umbrella of danger each week. This is, if I'm not mistaken, this is Ukrainians singing and worshiping in a subway, kind of acting as a semi-bomb shelter for them in this moment. I was looking at other Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asia countries where Christianity is flat out outlawed, of people gathering in homes, singing quieter than maybe we sing because they're under threat. That worshiping and gathering together as the church for them might mean imprisonment. It might risk the safety of their family. It might even risk their lives or more. And yet they faithfully gather in secret every week. And it boggles my mind to see how with so much at stake, they're not willing to give it up. With so much at stake, they are not willing to give it up. And yet we view it as optional, right? So many in our world, in our culture, we view it as optional, that it's too inconvenient to wake up on a Sunday morning, so it's not worth it. And yet they're putting their very lives at risk to be there. And seriously, this should give us pause. I try not to do a lot of false dichotomies, false equivalences, and I don't think this is one, but to be more frank, we have to decide if, one, either we're too flippant and uncaring about the gathering of the church, or if our brothers and sisters in those other cultures are simply dumb and irresponsible. Are we too uncaring and flippant about the gathering, or are they irresponsible and unintelligent because they don't have to be risking that? You're right? Either the church isn't all that important and they shouldn't risk so much, is one option, or they're right and we need to start taking this a whole lot more seriously. Right? And let me tell you right now, I don't think they're the ones who have it wrong. I don't think they're the ones who have it wrong. And I hope that can be something that's been stuck with me for a few days now. I hope that's something that you can reflect on too. What would it look like to meet these churches, to meet these Christians in heaven, and talk about our experience compared to theirs, and what we grumbled about, what we found inconvenient, what we thought about the church? The crackers tasted worse this week than last week. And no, compared to their challenges, man, I hope it can drive us to a renewed appreciation. And I think, to start a new point here, I think one of the things we've forgotten about the gathering on the first day of the week that would help us value this time together more is to be reminded that when we come together, when the Christians gather in worship, there is an inbreaking of heaven on earth. That when we do what we are doing right now, in this moment, in this place, heaven breaks in to this fallen, broken world. And we experience heaven on earth right here and right now. Just look at what we have here right here, okay? It's a gathering of the saved who are joined by God in their presence, who worship Him, who speak with Him through prayer, who learn more deeply of Him, who gather around the table to celebrate His defeat over evil. That's what we're doing, isn't it? Now, think about what the Bible describes heaven as being. They're saved there with God, worshiping, speaking with Him, learning, and feasting at that messianic banquet. It's not all that different, is it? It's not all that different. Our service this morning, right here, right now, brings heaven to earth. And when we remember that, when we look for that, because we can miss it, we can go our whole lives and see this no different than a movie theater where we're sitting forward. I guess we have some food, so it's more like La Comedia, okay? All right? Where you're sitting here, we face forward, and we can get nothing out of it. We can miss the transformation. We can miss the beauty. We can miss the divine encounter interaction here. But we shouldn't. We have to be aware and be looking. And not only does this assembly, this gathering, bring heaven down, check this out, it also brings us up. And I like this. Not only does it bring heaven down, it brings us up. We read Hebrews 10, 24, and 25 a lot, don't we? The passage I read and maybe warned us to be a little careful about. Yeah, we read that a lot. But what if we read the whole paragraph? Okay, scandalous thought, I know. Scandalous thought. But what if we read the whole paragraph? In fact, Hebrews 19 through 25 is really, in Greek, one long sentence. A very long sentence, okay? It's like 6 verses. But it's one sentence. So when we read Hebrews 10, 24, and 25, without 19 through 23, not only are we taking that passage out of its context, we're literally cutting in the middle of a sentence and reading the conclusion of the sentence without reading the first half. I hope you wouldn't do that to my sermons. You could. Now you can go on YouTube and clip out a little bit and make me sound all sorts of like a heretic. But we got to read the whole thing. And so here's what it is. This is Hebrews 19 and on. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is His body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. There's a period there. There's not when the writer of Hebrews wrote it. He didn't put a period there. Keep reading. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward good or love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. It's a much bigger thought, isn't it? There's a lot more there. And the first time you read it, it might seem like he's mixing a lot of images that don't actually make one cohesive thought. I mean, it's so long that when you add it all up, it feels like, well, he's talking about temples, and he's talking about curtains, and he's talking about God, he's talking about baptism, he's talking about the assembly, he's talking about good deeds, and there's so much going on. I understand that. But when you slow down and see the whole picture, what he's really saying is that when we gather together and spur one another on, we enter into that most holy place. We enter into that sanctuary of God. That's the first part of the sentence. We can enter into the sanctuary of God by not giving up meeting together and spurring one another on towards love and good deeds. It is by coming together that we are brought before God. He says, thanks to the blood and the flesh of Jesus that we pass through, we can gather together and enter God's dwelling place. I think that's pretty cool. In fact, I kind of get little images of Isaiah 6, where Isaiah is kind of transported all of a sudden into the throne room of God, and he has that discussion with God, if you remember that passage. When we gather together as those covered by the blood of Jesus, those who have passed through the curtain, that is Jesus, we are transported in this moment through time and space to enter into his sanctuary. Might sound a little mystic for us Church of Christers, I know. But think about it. In a sense, not only does God meet us here, we meet God there. It might not look any different. It might not feel any different. But according to the writer of Hebrews, we're brought before the dwelling place of God when we come here together. And really, that shouldn't sound too weird. That shouldn't be too hard for us to accept. The Bible tells us already in very similar terms in 1 Corinthians 3 that we're the temple of God. You remember this one. Paul writes, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple." So some old translations of this just had you. Don't you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? This translation does a little better job of pointing out that the you in Greek is plural. It's y'all. English is behind. We need a plural you. We need more y'alls in our language, okay? This is y'all. Don't you know that y'all are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in y'all's midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and y'all together are that temple. So being transported into the throne room of God is not so weird an idea when we already accept this one, right? That when we gather, we become the temple of God in this world. When we gather, we become more than ourselves. We become more than what we can see, what we can feel, what we can taste, smell, or whatever. We become the temple of God in this world because when we are here, we encounter the divine. I like to say that we're the earthly counterpart to that heavenly congregation that already exists beyond us, right? Those loved ones who aren't here anymore, they're gathered before the throne room of God. And in this moment, we become that earthly congregation that meets up and worships alongside those that are already there, worshiping and gathered around God. It's a miraculous thing that happens when we gather here. No, we're not always going to be in the mindset to appreciate that on a Sunday morning. We're human. But shouldn't we try to? Shouldn't we hold this gathering to the same value that God does, that the earliest disciples did? Shouldn't we come into the assembly expectant to be transformed and impacted by the God who meets us here? The gathering of the saints, is a much bigger deal than we typically realize. And the more that we acknowledge that, the more that we're going to be able to experience its beauty. It starts with awareness, like so many other things. Once we realize the great power and the great importance that is laid upon us coming together as a family, the more that we'll be able to see it and appreciate it moving forward. Now, once again, this is it's not an attempt by some preacher just to fill his pews, okay? It's not what this is. It's not an attempt to guilt those who have or still are absent. I hope that you see it as a conviction of a believer who's continually having his own eyes opened to see the beauty and the transformational power that is had when we gather together as brothers and sisters. And I pray that God never stops surprising us with a new love for his people and what happens in the body of the resurrected Lord that we represent on this earth. If you're here this morning and you'd like to be a part of that family, a family that has not left each other, that has not stopped gathering for 2,000 years, the Bible tells us that God adds us to that family when we wash through those pure waters, as Hebrews 10 put it earlier. We'd like to invite you to make that decision today. You need only to come as we stand and as we sing.